Welcome to the Solemn Vanguard channel. We've been getting some more results. The metagame is stabilizing and I figured we could go over the best decks of the moment. But before that, don't forget to pick up your Zero Damage Gaming playmats at the link in the description. Use the code REBOOT to get 10% off, or pick up a Zero Damage Gaming backpack. Gotta bring your decks and playmats to the store somehow anyway. Now, Destructive Roar has been out for a while in Japan. Q4 has been out for a while in the English game, and now we basically have 7 clans playable in the standard metagame. Because RNG or variance is higher in standard due to having less trigger checks overall, but those trigger checks having more impact than ever before, it is true that most of these 7 decks are closer to each other in terms of being able to win than, let's say, certain decks in G. If you try to compare a Silverthorn deck to a Coral deck, you simply couldn't. There were miles between the two decks. But standard has way more variance, and thus even the decks lower on this list have a solid chance of still doing well. Just keep that in mind. So for this tier list, I'll be using the system we often see for video games and in the Japanese meta. S, A, B, C, and maybe someday we'll even get to the D. Since this is the first time I'm showing this system on the channel, I'll quickly go over how these are defined. S tier would be populated by the very best deck of the format, which generally has no bad matchups and if piloted well, would only lose due to variance. Not every meta has a deck in S tier. Sometimes the game is so balanced that there is no S tier at all. A tier would be populated by the best decks of the format, which can still have counters. Usually your A tier will have multiple decks in it, since if there's no decks competing against each other in the A tier and you would only have a single deck in A, you might as well put it in S. To create some comparison, at one point in the G format you had 3 decks that were better than all others: Sanctuary Guard Dragon, Gear Chronicle, and Grand Blue. They were all dominating the meta, but neither of them was really the strongest deck. Therefore, we'd put all 3 in the A tier. Now, B tier would be populated by good decks, which absolutely still top, but have some unfavorable matchups here and there, or maybe rely on some variance, or are very consistent but don't have the best high roll outcome. In B tier, you could also put decks that are really good, but maybe require way more skill to master, to a point where you don't see them topping as often, since they have a high skill floor. Regardless of how you want to define B tier, these are decks that can and will top quite consistently enough, but not necessarily as often as A tier. Finally, we have C and or D tier. These decks could use some help. Now, while they aren't necessarily worthless or anything like that, they will be seen topping less. Regardless, as I mentioned before, with the amount of variance standard has right now, even these can still be seen topping. But when you make these decks, piloted by good players, play 1,000 games against things in the higher tiers, also piloted by good players, they will generally have less favorable results. So with that long explanation out of the way, let's get into the list. In the current format, taking multiple results from tournaments all over Japan, as well as playtesting in the West into account, we do have one obvious contender for the S tier. This should come as no surprise, but it's Oracle Think Tank. The single best deck of the format after the release of Destructive Roar is still OTT. The reason is quite simple. It pluses way too damn much and doesn't really care about RNG all that much. It can deny damage for a century and then finish you off on Deer if it's necessary given the matchup. It can stack triggers for days. I mentioned it before, but triggers have a bigger influence on the game now more than ever before. And when you're able to hit them so damn consistently, things get scary. They also have Promise Daughter, which completely nullifies the whole point of any retiring any deck may have, which further stops your opponent from minusing you at all. When you're able to filter the top of your deck so hardcore every turn, you're basically having a triple or even quadruple drive check every turn in a game where most decks are stuck on 2 checks. And again, whilst every other deck is stuck behind the variance wall, let's say, OTT simply is not. Out of all tournament results, Oracle just keeps popping up in every top and therefore it's in my S tier. Now, before getting to A tier, given the small amount of decks and even more results still coming in, I will be merging A and B tier for this video. When I initially started making the list and looking at various results, things seemed to shift around quite aggressively. So whilst OTT is the absolute top in every single way and deserves its S tier spot, and the decks I want to put in C absolutely belong there as well, the decks I put in A and B could just swing all over the place. Therefore, I am putting them together in an A-B tier, let's say, for now, and the lines will probably get more defined when more clans are added to the game. So now sit back and enjoy your A-B tier clans. First, we have Spike Brothers, our new best friend from Destructive Roar. I think Spike Brothers is a good example of what power creep looks like. Whilst we can't really look at it in the same way as, let's say, the creep from GBT 13 to GBT 14, because there aren't that many decks yet, it is funny how Spikes just has higher numbers than, for example, Royal Paladin, with no apparent trade-off. The deck scales well, hits hard as hell, and is just a really solid deck all around. Next up is Tachi. I discussed this before with Chris from Different Fight, and he had a tough time really getting a feel for this deck. It plays quite a bit differently than the rest of the standard decks, and it has really solid potential. When I first made my list, this deck just felt awkward. Some people say it's amazing, others say it's terrible. It's very awkward how this deck is being perceived so differently by different people. So I just really want to see even more results before judging whether this should be A or B or whatever. So luckily we have the A-B tier for now. Next we have Kagura. This deck is consistent, Waterfall is a really solid finisher, and retiring has more impact in Standard than it had in G for now. Its primary issue is that it doesn't like OTT all that much. Regardless, I'll be looking out for this clan because it's really good right now, and it'll get even more support in the mini booster. I'm looking at you, Nouvelle. The final deck for the A-B tier is Royal Paladins. Royals are just consistent as hell, but don't really push all that well. They're like a really well-oiled machine, but the machine itself isn't all that powerful, if that makes any sense. Now, getting into C tier, I'm sure I'll be making many people sad, but most probably saw it coming. We start with Nova Grappler. I will say that if things go in favor of Nova, they can give OTT some problems, but for that to even happen, things need to go in their favor. Novas are overcosted and are hurt way too much by damage denial. They're also hurt way too much by defensive triggers, and they don't really get the hand to fill the field they require to do what they're supposed to do. I know that when piloted well and with some variance they can do some damage, but for now they usually fall a bit short. Finally, for this tier list we end with Mega Colony in the C tier. This one surprised me the most when looking at the cards in a vacuum, like before the release. The clans seem to have cool tricks, and while they can definitely be annoying, they just don't really do much beyond stalling. The main issue is that they have a lot of cards that seem to do things that can work together, but they don't really have the plussing to put it all together. The engine feels like unfinished, if that makes sense. Now, I've said it before and I'll say it again, play whatever the hell you want. Given the RNG of triggers, you could do well with any of the decks on this list. If you like the art or the playstyle of Mega Colony, just go for it. If you want to play Royal Paladins, enjoy. But know that no matter what, OTT will beat the shit out of you.